Gervais Restaurant, authentic French cuisine in Silicon Valley.
Our move into open source beyond Linux is poised to have a bigger impact on the market than Linux did itself. And so let me tell you why. And so what we've learned is we can reach new customers. We can also give better solutions to our existing customers, and those new customers have generally fallen in the area of small and medium business as well as the emerging countries. And we're going to be as bold about open source as we are with Linux. And we have built and are building an open source business very much modeled on what we learned across Linux, Apache, and Eclipse. And so let me just try to describe it. There's actually 8 broad areas that are outlined in your press release, but I'm going to group them into 4 areas just to make it a little bit more palatable so you can understand why we think it'll have such a big impact. First, let me talk about the desktop. So that'll be the largest impact over the next 3 years will come from what's happening in the desktop area. And there's 2 forces that are coming together here. One is, there's this one, you need applications. And so we are bringing our 2 biggest mass market applications to market on Linux on the desktop. We announced last month that we're bringing Lotus Notes native to Linux, that is now shipping, generally available worldwide to customers. We have 125 million Lotus Notes customers, so that actually opens up Linux to a lot of customers to bring volume, which is important for new markets, because as I often say, momentum breeds momentum in this space, but you need apps. Those customers that are Notes customers generally also use SameTime, so what we're announcing is that we're bringing SameTime native to Linux as well, and that'll be available in the next 30 days. So now you have 2 kind of killer applications for the desktop. And when you really think about what happened with Linux, it started on the server, and it was because there were 2 killer applications, Apache, which is now on 68% of web servers, and Samba, which was the second most used application, which was again a server-based application. But one of the reasons that they had so much impact is those open source packages were on open source beyond Linux. Apache runs on Windows, and that got huge volumes, as well as all the Unix platforms. So I said there are 2 things coming together on the desktop. 1, these 2 apps. 2, how we develop those 2 apps. We developed both of the applications using Eclipse RCP, Rich Client Platform. That's Eclipse 3.0. Most of you know Eclipse as just used for developing development tools. We're now using Eclipse to develop end-user applications. A huge new use for Eclipse, and that is an open source project that runs on Windows, Linux, and the Mac. So the first time we are now offering a platform for developers that'll let them write one application that picks up all the Windows volumes, so it cost justifies it, as well as picking up Linux and the Mac for additional opportunity. Because it was very difficult to close the business case to just write for the Linux volumes. We've solved that equation by doing exactly what was successful on servers, which was Java as a single programming model to pick up all the operating systems on the servers. So this has happened before. So now we have 2 applications. We're leading the way by shipping Notes and SameTime on Eclipse RCP. The next release of Notes and SameTime, we're going to use that code base to deliver our Windows version, our Linux version, and our Mac with one single code base. So we're leading the way, the time is here, we can now develop cross-platform applications for the desktop. So that next release of Notes, which is called Hanover, will be using this same code base that's now already generally available on Linux today. That same Hanover release will also support the IBM productivity editors, which are also written to Eclipse RCP that basically have a word processing spreadsheet and graphics program that support ODF, the open document format. And so that'll reach all of our Notes customers for no additional charge. They'll get these editors on Windows, Linux, and the Mac. So now we have a third kind of application in that framework. And we're also developing over a dozen other IBM applications. All the major applications being developed for the desktop are now being developed using Eclipse RCP so that you can hit multi-platform. And we have 100 ISVs who are also committed to writing applications using this platform, including SAP and Adobe and others that were demonstrating at our Linux desktop forum yesterday. So the desktop is the big one of the 4 categories in this open source beyond Linux. And mainly because it is beyond Linux. This will be open source on Windows, and open source on Linux, and open source on the Mac, write once, hit all 3, and it closes the business case. That fundamentally changes the business model around delivering applications. And that's one of the interesting lessons that we've learned from Linux is part of it was a development model of using open source for development. But just as big an impact was that Linux changed the business model of how you deliver this software to customers.
Gervais Restaurant, authentic French cuisine in Silicon Valley.
The second area in broad categories is just in general software. And so we have, Eclipse still as a development environment is very important to us, and we have investments going on there. In the web server space, last year we acquired a company called Blue Code that had a J2EE app server that was based on the Apache Geronimo technology. So we're extending Apache from a web server to a J2EE app server. And now we're really driving that out into the market to reach new customers, as I mentioned. And so one of the nice things about Geronimo, which we now resell as WebSphere Application Server Community Edition, is they had traction much broader and deeper into the SMB space than we had with our existing WebSphere strategy. So we're now taking that to also reach, not only SMB, but the BRIC countries, and we're distributing it into solutions that position it really as an advanced LAMP stack, if you will. So we have an open technology platform based on WebSphere Community Edition with DB2 Express C, another application. Here we're testing just the business model side of open source. So it's a no license fee software, but it's not using open source. So we're using the open source licensing model, but not the development model. So we've now learned we can separate out the two. We've packaged DB2 Express C and WebSphere together into something we call an open technology platform. We're shipping it as with AMD processors as an OpenStack appliance. We're shipping it with Intel processors as something called the integrated Linux or integrated stack for Linux. And Centric CRM is here today with their customer, US Food Service. They're actually built their CRM application on this open technology platform, and they're here to answer questions. So we've now got ISVs developing for this, reaching again the SMB space and new customers with this overall strategy. Moving on to the next broad category, the third, is hardware. So we've figured out that a lot of this collaborative innovation and ways to deliver value to customers more efficiently can be done with hardware as well as software. So Power.org and Blade.org and what we're doing with Grid are modeled after this, that we can have companies all collaborating on the future of power, where IBM focuses on where our core values are and our competencies, which is mainly around using power in servers. The gaming people use power in the game consoles. Other companies are involved. There's 13,000 members of the Power.org development community, and there's other companies in there that are actually delivering products based on power to service their markets. So, open source allows us to expand technology that in areas that are bigger than any one vendor. And so we can reach out and just broaden an industry standard. We'll focus on our core competency area, but other people can focus on theirs, and it just broadens that technology to the point where it creates a whole economic ecosystem around the technology. Same with Blade.org. With Blade.org, there's over 600 partners in the Blade Center Alliance and Blade.org who, IBM focuses on servers for Blade, Cisco focuses on networking equipment, and we have security vendors focused on security blades. And customers can now integrate many things together that they have to integrate in their environment and simplify. And we can leverage this whole community around. The community innovates on the standard, and we focus on value add on top of the standard in the businesses we choose to serve. And then the fourth area I'm actually very excited about, because this really has the chance to change the horizon and broaden the aperture of where open source will affect the industry, because it gets beyond the IT vendors. And that's what IBM Global Services and research are doing to help our customers innovate with open source like IT vendors already have. So I've already shared many examples how we as an IT vendor have used open source to advance our business model and reach new customers. But a good example of this is an announcement we made Thursday, which really helps me illuminate what I mean by this, which is we announced that we were open sourcing some technology called the Open Healthcare Framework. And the story behind this is pretty interesting, because everyone wanted to have electronic medical records, and everybody was collaborating on a specification. It is really hard to get people to collaborate on a spec. specs are boring, it's hard to collaborate on a document, but an implementation of the standard you can collaborate on. So we wrote some software that implemented this open healthcare framework and wanted to get some companies collaborating on it. And so to jumpstart that, IBM Research wrote the software. IBM Research created a health information exchange. And so we actually created a hub on our premise and connected together multiple healthcare institutions. We got 12 ISVs involved who wrote their software so it interfaced with this new standard. And we launched this last year, and so for a year we got it working. So it uses my favorite phrase of doing it once in a row to get some experience and get a working implementation of this open healthcare framework. Now we've got this working, we're doing real work with real health institutions and real ISVs, and now we've realized it's ready to be open sourced, and so we open sourced the technology on Thursday. Now all ISVs can use it. We won't have any more development work. When you have people who all say they want to support an open standard, they do duplicate development work to be exactly the same, because they're all trying to support the same standard. By open sourcing the software, there is no more duplicate development work. Everyone has the same code, and there's one community edition of the code. By definition, it's compatible with itself, right? So you've solved the problem, and now all these people in the healthcare industry, so this is non-IT, are developing value add on top of the standard. So the customers get more value out of this model than they did with the old model. So we're giving more value to customers than they were getting before by using open source implementations of open standards. So, in essence, in reality, open source accelerates the adoption of open standards. And that is the key to this whole business model. So that's just one example, and in 5 years, all sorts of innovation is going to occur more efficiently than it would have without this. Just like 5 years ago with Linux, we could focus not only just on innovating in Linux, where Dan puts a little in, but we get a lot out, because when we ship Red Hat or Novell Linux, we're getting all the innovation that everybody contributed. But we focused on our value add, hardware, software, services around the standard, around Linux. In healthcare, 5 years from now, we're not, who knows, what will get created out of this, but it'll be a lot more efficient way to deliver value to the customers.
Gervais Restaurant, authentic French cuisine in Silicon Valley.
So, with that in mind, IBM Global Services has created both Global Business Services and Global Technology Services, an open source business within themselves to help customers innovate with open source in, not just IT customers, but non-IT customers. And whenever they're supporting an open standard, where they're doing duplicate development work to be exactly the same, we look for that and say, maybe there's a more efficient way to open source some of this technology within an industry and help our customers more profitably deliver value to their customers. So this opens up the aperture beyond IT thoughts around open source, and really will have a much broader impact than Linux did by itself. Linux or Apache or Eclipse, which were more technology focused as opposed to business focused. And that's the part of the business I get pretty excited about. And I also, this is one of the advantages of the way IBM approaches the open source business, is we have hardware, software, and services, so we can look at much more of a solution approach in helping our customers, and we have the breadth and depth and experience to actually deliver based on a lot of good learning and traction we already have in open source beyond Linux for these broad areas. So, in closing, that's really what the genesis of this open source business is we'll have Linux and then open source beyond Linux in these 4 broad areas. There's 8 specific areas underneath them. We're managing it like we did the Linux business, with one slight change in that with Linux we started as an overlay group, and then as it got big we injected it into the fabric of IBM. With open source beyond Linux, we're going to, I mentioned, be as aggressive as we were with Linux and leapfrog right to the injection stage. With each group, we figured out who the business owner within IBM is, and they're already assigned, they already have metrics in place, targets in place, and we're growing and reaching new customers in each of the 8 areas now. And so we decided it was a good time to come out and talk about how broad this has become, because we do think it'll have a major positive impact on the industry. And so with that, that's really the conclusion of our news today, and I'll take questions. Eclipse 3.0, includes this RCP, and yes, so there's a runtime that runs on Windows, one on Linux, one on the Mac. The one on Windows just renders the application in Win32. The one on Linux renders it in GNOME, and the one on the Mac renders it in Mac OS X. So that's all included in the software, and it's using an underlying Eclipse framework. We often talk about client-side middleware because we do have a J2EE stack that you can get for it if the application wants it. So when you heard us talk about workplace client technologies, we actually put some additional middleware layers on there that applications can optionally use. We have a SyncML engine to do the server-managed client that's open. We put Cloudscape in as the database, and people said, well, that's not open source, so we open sourced it. And that became Apache Derby, so that's the database for Apache Derby. So we've created a whole environment with some optional middleware stacks that run across them. But to really answer your question, there is a runtime that runs on each of the OSs that renders the application specific, so that your app doesn't have to have specific code.
And why not Java for that?
Well, Java's an option, so you can use Java, OpenAjax. It can just be a browser-based app if you want. I mean, it really is open. Eclipse is a plug-in architecture, and you can write in any language you want, including assembler if you really have a language as opposed to, and so it's just one of the many language runtimes that you could run on, and it's one of the supported ones on Eclipse RC. Each of the areas we look for a place that we can, support what will be the industry standard open for that particular area. So in web servers, it's Apache. In operating systems, for us, the open operating system that's on multiple platforms is Linux. I mean, we have no confusion. So, that's why. And so AIX is a higher end, Unix environment that we use up to. We just announced a new 32-way, 64 CPU, 32 socket server, which are things that Linux can't scale to yet. So we don't try to confuse the two. We're in both businesses. They're both growth businesses for us. That was on AIX. What was the other one? Oh, Power. There we're just looking at the fine balance of what's the right level of open source. We actually do look at, can we be more open than we're being now? Right now we're being very successful with our strategy. I mentioned we have 13,000 developers in the power.org ecosystem. I'm in meetings with those guys all the time about can we be even more open, which I'm encouraging them to be. And so we always look at what's the right balance. You also don't want to you don't want the architecture to not be compatible with itself moving forward. That's the other side of having too many people wanting to change it, kind of things on a hardware architecture. So hardware is a little different, and we're okay with that. So we're okay that hardware is a little different than software. Software was a little different than what was before it. Software wasn't the first open source, research was. We learned a lot from how researchers shared information as scientists, right? And they did it a little different than software. It's the model of collaborative innovation that's important here, and that's the common thread. And for each community, you have to adjust to what serves the community best, not what is exactly like how someone else. We have a very good track record of backing open source projects that end up succeeding and having volume. And so if you look at Eclipse, if you look at Apache, if you look at Linux, and so we don't tend to back generally more self-serving projects that end up not getting traction. We don't have any of those in our history. So, and that's because we've come to realize that as much as there's an open source development model, and so open sourcing code is interesting, it is about the traction and the revenue flow that comes across that open source project. So Linux is successful because so many people are buying solutions based on Linux. There's a revenue flow across the open source technology, much greater than the revenue that's generated from the Linux OS itself. It's the hardware, software, and services around it. So that ecosystem funds the success of the project. The ecosystem around web servers is what funds and why Apache survives, is this really interesting middle layer with 68% share. We understand that model, and I'm not sure the projects you brought up are good examples of tremendous traction in the marketplace. Because we don't think there's room in the marketplace for a third high volume OS on x86. There's room for a proprietary one and one open one. And once one's open, you don't need any more.
Yeah, Jean-Baptiste Su with La Tribune in Paris. When do you expect Linux on the desktop to actually boom? And do you think that this Eclipse 3.0 might help? And then just a follow-up with Steve's question, do you think it makes sense to maybe open source some of the other IBM software products apart from AIX, like DB2 or WebSphere, for example?
So on the desktop, when will it really take off? So you know, it's still, well, actually more copies of Linux desktop will ship than Linux servers. It's interesting. It's just less market share because the numbers are so much bigger. So 7 to 9 million will ship this year. One of the huge inhibitors was the fact that there wasn't really a good economic business model for people to write applications. So we've now injected one that's ready for prime time, and we're proving it by putting our money where our mouth is with our 2 biggest applications for the desktop. What that'll cause is, if you look at the history of when we did this with Java, Java, we said, was the strategic industry cross-platform operating environment for servers in 1995. You know, within 5 years, you know, tremendous success of Java, and it had, you know, established itself in the market. So these things take a while, but as I mentioned, I think within 3 years you'll see an impact that's greater than Linux because of this shift to open source beyond Linux. Because a lot of the impact of Eclipse RCP will be on Windows, right? People will be running these applications on Windows. That will give us the volume. It'll be Windows plus Linux plus the Mac that'll establish the ecosystem, not just Linux.
Yeah. And on the DB2 WebSphere open source?
So, you know, from a WebSphere point of view, we now have an open source version of the WebSphere application server, right? So WebSphere Community Edition. So we keep toying with these things and looking for the market need to reach new customers, combined with, you know, what's a standard versus our value add on top of the standard. So that's the current mix with WebSphere. With DB2, I mentioned we open sourced a database that became Apache Derby. But we also have DB2 Express C, where we're trying it's a private source development model, but an open source licensing model. So we're testing that. So in some cases, we're just testing the market need. But we base these things based on, you know, the market and what the market will buy and what our customers buy. Basically, we're trying to be as customer driven as possible to optimize how we can deliver value to those customers.
Notes?
So we always look at them.
Yeah. Notes?
I think, you know, with that, our priority, the question was notes for those who couldn't hear it, our priority there is to first establish the open source ecosystem around Eclipse RCP and that client-side middleware. If we see a need where we can accelerate that by open sourcing other applications, we will, but we're currently not considering those.
Gervais Restaurant, authentique French cuisine in Silicon Valley.